The silence of the remote mountain pass was a physical presence, a weight I'd grown accustomed to, almost welcomed. It pressed in from every direction, broken only by the hum of ancient equipment in the observatory's nerve center and the occasional dry whisper of wind through the sparse desert scrub. For 15 years, this desolate stretch of land had been my world, a canvas of sun-baked rock and star-dusted night. My observatory wasn't a gleaming testament to modern science, but a collection of repurposed instruments and meticulously maintained archival data, all focused on archaeoastronomy. I charted the rise and set of stars as they would have been seen millennia ago, correlating these movements with the layouts of ancient stone circles and subterranean temples across the globe. I sat hunched over a bank of monitors, my fingers stained with graphite from a half-eaten sandwich and the endless annotations on star charts. My current project involved a series of seismic anomalies reported by a small geological survey crew operating a few kilometers west, near an old mining claim. They'd been mapping subterranean strata, looking for new mineral deposits, but had hit something unexpected. The preliminary reports were vague, speaking of unusual density variations and non-geological echo patterns. The crew chief, a grizzled prospector with a perpetually worried frown, had called me a week ago, his voice tight with an unease that went beyond typical geological frustrations. Then, the call stopped. My interest wasn't in minerals. Something about the prospector's description, about the way he'd stumbled over his words describing impossible angles, and a hum that vibrated in your teeth, had snagged a hook deep within my archaeoastronomer's mind. Ancient cultures often aligned their structures not just with the visible sky, but with unseen forces, with telluric currents or hidden energies. Could this be one such forgotten nexus? I had spent the last 3 days sifting through my own seismic data, cross-referencing it with the limited information I had from the prospector. My instruments, designed primarily to detect subtle shifts in the Earth's crust that might impact celestial observations, were now my primary focus. The graphs on my screen usually showed a predictable rhythm of micro-tremors, distant quakes, and the occasional blast from a faraway quarry. But now, nestled within the expected noise, was a recurring pattern, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse. It wasn't a standard seismic wave. It was too regular, too precise. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. The pulse repeated every 27, 32 days, exactly. The sidereal period of the moon. Coincidence? My mind, trained to seek patterns in the cosmic dance, rejected the notion. Nothing in the natural world was that exact, that consistent unless it was part of a grander celestial mechanism. I isolated the signal, filtering out the background noise, pushing the limits of my aging equipment. The pulse became clearer, a rhythmic thrum, like a giant, slow heartbeat. Its epicenter, according to my triangulated readings, was precisely where the prospector's crew had reported their discovery, deep beneath the remote mountain pass, at the coordinates of the newly revealed subterranean structure. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the gain, pushing the signal to its maximum amplitude. What I heard next was not a vibration, but a sound. A low, resonant hum, a single, sustained note that seemed to originate not from the speakers, but from within my own skull. It was too deep to be heard, yet too present to be ignored. It was a frequency that bypassed my ears entirely, resonating in my bones, vibrating in the marrow. I pulled back from the screen, my chair scraping against the concrete floor. The hum intensified, a pressure building behind my eyes. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. It felt ancient, vast, and utterly alien. My instruments, usually so stoic, began to flicker erratically. The ambient temperature in the observatory seemed to drop several degrees, raising goosebumps on my arms. This wasn't an ancient alignment I was deciphering. This was something active, something responding. The screen flickered again, and then, superimposed over the seismic graphs, a new pattern emerged. It wasn't a wave, not a frequency, but a series of geometric shapes, slowly coalescing from the spectral data. Lines of perfect symmetry, forming impossible angles, rotating and expanding. They were not static images, but fluid, shifting constructs that defied any known geometry. My mind struggled to process them, feeling a strange, unsettling pull, like a compass needle gone wild, trying to orient itself to a pole that didn't exist. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was beyond archaeoastronomy, beyond geology. This was a signal from something that should not exist, radiating from a place that had only just revealed itself. The hum in my head grew louder, a siren call from the depths, promising answers but hinting at a truth that felt too vast, too terrifying for a single mind to hold. The silence of the remote mountain pass, the one I'd grown to almost crave, had a different quality this morning. It wasn't the welcoming hush I knew, but a taut, waiting quiet. The desert light, already a harsh chisel against the eastern peaks, promised another day of relentless heat. I moved my ground-penetrating radar unit, a sophisticated array of sensors mounted on a small, all-terrain cart, across the designated grid section. Each slow, deliberate pass sent electromagnetic pulses deep into the parched earth, mapping the ancient secrets beneath. The cart's low hum and the rhythmic thump-thump of my boots on the compacted sand were the only disruptions to the vast, empty expanse. My eyes were glued to the console display, a high-resolution screen showing the subsurface strata in vibrant, false-color profiles. For weeks, I'd been meticulously surveying the area around a known ancient alignment site, a cluster of weathered megaliths that pointed with uncanny precision to specific celestial events thousands of years ago. My goal was to uncover any associated structures, perhaps hidden ceremonial chambers or foundations that had succumbed to the shifting sands of millennia. Most days yielded predictable results: sedimentary layers, pockets of mineral deposits, the occasional unremarkable geological fault. Today, however, felt different. My skin prickled, a faint tremor that had nothing to do with the vibrations of the cart. I was halfway through a transect, the sun already searing the back of my neck when the first anomaly registered. A faint, almost imperceptible distortion in the otherwise consistent subsurface data. It was just a flicker, a ghost in the machine's readout, easily dismissed as interference or a minor sensor glitch. But something held me. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of a gloved hand, and recalibrated the unit, running the same sweep again, slower this time. The flicker returned, stronger. My breath hitched. This wasn't random noise. On the display, a narrow, impossibly straight line appeared, cutting diagonally through the natural rock formations at a depth far exceeding any known ancient construction. My heart gave a surprised lurch. I'd seen remnants of foundations, yes, but they were always shallow, fragmented, and clearly man-made. This was different. I adjusted the GPR's frequency and power settings, increasing its penetration depth, and pushed the cart forward, following the anomaly. The line on the screen resolved into a distinct edge, sharp and unyielding, unlike the blurred, organic contours of natural rock. It extended for meters, then tens of meters, then hundreds, refusing to dissipate or blend back into the surrounding geology. The display, usually a canvas of reds, yellows, and greens denoting varying densities, now showed a vast, uniform blue-black mass, deeper and denser than anything I'd ever encountered. My initial scientific excitement, a familiar rush of adrenaline at the prospect of a monumental archaeological find, began to mix with a peculiar, unsettling chill. The sheer scale was baffling. I was mapping something colossal, buried hundreds of meters beneath the desert floor. No known ancient civilization possessed the technology or the manpower to construct something of this magnitude, let alone bury it so deeply and so perfectly. I spent the next several hours in a feverish, almost trance-like state, expanding my survey grid, meticulously mapping the contours of the buried object. The sun climbed higher, baking the air, but I barely noticed. My focus was absolute, my mind racing through geological epochs, archaeological timelines, anything that could explain what my equipment was revealing. The structure wasn't just large, it was geometrically precise. Square corners, flat planes, and what appeared to be vast, intersecting corridors or chambers began to emerge on the 3D rendering. It was a perfect cube, then a rectangle, then something more complex, its form defying the chaotic processes of natural geological formation. The edges were too sharp, the angles too exact. It was a construction, undoubtedly, but by whom and how? The blue-black mass on my screen was utterly alien to the desert strata. It didn't reflect the same energy signatures as granite, sandstone, or basalt. It was something else entirely, something that absorbed the radar pulses with an unnerving efficiency, giving back a consistent, impenetrable signal. My gaze drifted from the screen to the remote mountain pass stretching out before me, the same ancient landscape I'd studied for years. Had this been here all along, buried beneath the very ground I walked? The thought was a disquieting whisper in my mind. This wasn't merely an ancient site. It was an anomaly, a wound in the fabric of my understanding. The structure wasn't just non-terrestrial in its composition, it felt non-terrestrial in its very existence. I stared at the shimmering, impossible form on my console, my fingers hovering over the controls. The data was unequivocal. My equipment, the most advanced I had, was confirming something that shouldn't be. What had I found? And what, in turn, had found me? I moved my ground-penetrating radar array, a bulky, finicky beast, into position just above the newly exposed mouth of the subterranean structure. My determination, a stubborn knot in my gut, pushed me past the creeping unease that had settled in since the discovery. The structure itself, a dark maw carved into the rock, seemed to drink the light. I had spent the previous day mapping its immediate vicinity, confirming its ancient origin, but now it was time to understand its composition, its hidden heart. I rigged my primary sensor suite, a portable spectrum analyzer, an EM field detector, and a custom-built receiver designed to pick up even the faintest non-natural frequencies around the opening. Each wire, each connection felt heavy in my hands, as if imbued with the weight of the unknown. Sweat trickled down my temples, stinging my eyes as I powered up the array. I watched the readouts intently, expecting the usual geological noise, the faint echoes of solar radiation, perhaps even the residual electromagnetic signatures of ancient, long-dead civilizations. But for the first few minutes there was nothing unusual. Just the expected background hum, a flat line of cosmic indifference. My fingers danced across the controls, a practiced rhythm of patience and precision. The sun climbed higher, baking the exposed rock, and the air shimmered above the pass. Then, a flicker, a barely perceptible deviation on the EM field detector, a blip that could have been a stray cosmic ray or a fault in the sensor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I reran the scan, focusing all the sensor's sensitivity on that specific vector. Nothing. My jaw tightened. Had I imagined it, the isolation could play tricks, I knew. I pushed the thought aside, forcing myself to be methodical. I initiated a long-duration, high-resolution sweep, instructing the system to log every anomaly, no matter how minute. Hours bled into one another. The shade from the peaks receded, leaving me exposed to the unrelenting sun. I drank from my canteen, the water warm but still a welcome relief. The data scrolled across the screens, an endless stream of digital gibberish until it wasn't. A pattern emerged, faint, almost drowned out by the natural electromagnetic chatter, but undeniably there. It was rhythmic, a pulse that wasn't quite regular, yet possessed an internal cadence, like a slow, deliberate breath. I leaned closer to the spectrum analyzer, my eyes straining. The waveform wasn't random noise. It was structured, complex, too intricate to be a geological tremor or a solar flare artifact. My hands trembled as I isolated the signal, stripping away the layers of interference. What remained was utterly unlike anything I had ever encountered. It resonated across multiple non-contiguous frequencies, shifting and weaving, almost like a melody played on an instrument with an infinite number of strings. Not a simple beep or a coded sequence, but something fluid, alive, yet distinctly unnatural. It wasn't a language I understood or even one I could begin to categorize. There were no discernible breaks, no repeating phrases that hinted at a grammar. It was a continuous stream, a vast, intricate tapestry of electromagnetic energy that pulsed with an internal logic I couldn't grasp. The term signal felt inadequate. This was more akin to an utterance, a sustained, resonant thing. I tried to visualize it, to process it through every filter and algorithm I possessed. The receiver hummed, a low vibration against my fingertips, and I felt a faint resonance deep within my own chest. It was like listening to a choir where every voice sang a different, unfathomable note, yet somehow they converged into a single, terrifyingly cohesive sound. A silent hymn played on reality itself. This wasn't just ancient. This was other. It spoke of distances and dimensions that twisted the mind, of an intelligence so profoundly alien that the very concept of communication felt like a fragile, pathetic human construct. I felt a prickle on my skin, as if the signal wasn't just passing through my equipment, but through me too. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air around me. The remote mountain pass, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like an exposed stage, and I, the sole audience to a performance I was utterly unqualified to witness. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, the plastic warm beneath my palm. I moved my truck, the old engine grumbling, through the narrow defile of the remote mountain pass. The silence, the one I'd grown to almost crave, had a different quality this morning. It wasn't the welcoming hush I knew, but a taut, waiting quiet, as if the very air held its breath. I drove straight to the subterranean structure, bypassing the observatory entirely. The signal was a demanding master now, a siren song that pulled me away from the familiar comfort of the telescopes. The entrance, a jagged tear in the sandstone, still felt wrong, an unnatural wound in the ancient rock. Inside, the air was cool, still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of disturbed earth. My portable array, a tangle of wires and receivers, sat where I'd left it, its indicator lights blinking patiently. I plunged into the work, the outside world fading to a distant hum. Hours blurred into a single, focused stream. The signal wasn't a simple frequency, not a burst of data, but a complex, layered pattern, like an impossible fractal unfolding in multiple dimensions. It defied every known principle of radio astronomy. I tried filtering, demodulating, spectral analysis, every technique in my arsenal. Each attempt yielded a glimpse of something vast and intricate, then dissolved into meaningless noise, only to reform in a different, equally baffling configuration. It was a language without grammar, a music without notes. "Come on," I muttered, my voice raspy in the cold silence. My fingers flew across the keyboard, adjusting parameters, cycling through algorithms. The screen glowed, a kaleidoscope of spectral lines and waveform anomalies. The first cognitive shift was subtle, a mere flicker. I was staring at a particularly dense section of the signal, a pattern of repeating non-Euclidean geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves when the room seemed to tilt. Just for a fraction of a second, the flat wall of the structure warped, the ceiling dipping, the floor rising. My stomach lurched. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back to normal. The concrete walls were solid, the floor level. I blinked, shaking my head. "Too much coffee," I mumbled, running a hand over my eyes. "Too many late nights." It had to be exhaustion, the strain of constant focus. I pushed it aside, forcing my attention back to the screen. They were faint, barely audible, woven into the static hum of the equipment. Not words, not exactly, but a texture of sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or sand sifting through an hourglass. A low, insistent murmur just beyond the threshold of understanding. I paused, tilting my head, straining to hear. Nothing but the drone of the air conditioning unit and the soft hiss of the receivers. I adjusted the noise cancellation on my headphones, but the sound persisted, a phantom echo in the periphery of my hearing. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. Auditory pareidolia. My brain, desperate for meaning, was constructing voices from random electrical interference. It was a common phenomenon for those working with audio for extended periods. I even knew the scientific explanation. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no respite. My dreams became vivid, almost hyperreal. I found myself standing on an impossibly vast plain, beneath a sky that bled colors I couldn't name. Towering structures, not built of stone or metal, but of pure, crystalline light, rose into the impossible firmament. Their angles were wrong, their geometry shifting and reforming even as I watched, defying every law of perspective. I felt no fear, only a profound, unsettling awe, a sense of being utterly insignificant before something ancient and immense. A deep, resonant tone, like the slow grinding of continental plates, vibrated through my bones. I woke with a gasp, the taste of dust in my mouth. The echo of that impossible geometry seared into my mind's eye. The memory of the dream clung to me, a persistent residue of unease. I tried to dismiss it as a byproduct of stress, of my obsession with the signal's complex patterns. My subconscious, I reasoned, was simply processing the strange visual data I'd been feeding it. But the image of those light structures, their impossible angles, felt too real, too specific. I spent another day, then another, locked in the subterranean chamber. The line between reality and the signal's influence blurred. I rubbed my temples, the dull ache behind my eyes a constant companion. This was what isolation did, I told myself. This was the price of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, of abandoning sleep and human contact for the sake of a discovery. My mind was simply protesting, rebelling against the relentless pressure. I was tired, profoundly, exhaustingly tired. What if it wasn't just fatigue? What if the signal, this impossible transmission, was doing something to me? Something beyond my comprehension, beyond my control. The silence, the vast, ancient silence of the rock, was usually a comfort. Today it felt like a held breath. Just as the pass opened onto the flatter expanse leading to the observatory, I saw it. A shimmer, not of heat haze, but something within the air itself, directly ahead. It was like a ripple in a pool, but vertical, stretching from the cracked asphalt to the distant, blurred horizon. For a fraction of a second, the very fabric of the visible world seemed to waver, colors bleeding into each other like wet paint. The ochre rocks on the right flickered, their ruddy hue momentarily deepening to a bruised purple, then snapping back. I blinked hard, my eyes stinging. The ripple was gone. "Just tired, Dean," I muttered, my voice rough. Too many late nights staring at static. I rubbed my eyes with the heel of my hand, the gritty sensation a welcome anchor. The sun was already a hammer on the windshield, and the air conditioning in the truck was more a suggestion than a reality. It had to be the heat, the glare, the sheer exhaustion from days spent chasing ghosts in the data. Back in the cool, climate-controlled bunker beneath the observatory, the familiar hum of equipment was a dull thrum against my skull. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. I pulled up the latest scan from the subterranean structure, the impossible signal still pulsing across the screen, a language without a speaker. My fingers danced over the console, adjusting filters, refining parameters. The signal was consistent, too complex to be natural, too alien to be artificial in any way I understood. As I leaned closer to the main monitor, a subtle shift occurred. The greens of the data display, usually a crisp, almost luminous emerald, seemed to soften, to blur at the edges, bleeding into the deep blues of the background. It wasn't a monitor calibration issue. I'd checked that an hour ago. It was as if my own eyes were struggling to resolve the distinct hues. I squinted, then leaned back, trying to shake off the peculiar sensation. The lines of code, the graphs, the spectral analyses, they all seemed to vibrate faintly, like individual pixels were fighting for their place on the grid. A prickle of unease started to spread through my chest. This wasn't just fatigue, This was persistent. I needed another perspective. I needed to talk to someone who understood the nuances of this kind of data, someone who could tell me I was wrong, that it was all just an elaborate misinterpretation. I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed the number for a colleague, a specialist in deep space telemetry. The connection crackled but held. "Dean, you sound like you're calling from the bottom of a well." The colleague's voice came through, tinny and distant. "I'm at the site," I replied, trying to keep my voice even professional. "Look, I've got something here, something utterly unprecedented, a signal from the subterranean structure." I launched into a rapid-fire explanation detailing the impossible bandwidth, the non-repeating yet structured patterns, the sheer otherness of it. I could hear the colleague sighing on the other end, a sound that grated on my frayed nerves. "Dean, I appreciate your enthusiasm," the colleague said, the words carefully measured, "but we've been over this. The initial surveys showed geological anomalies, nothing more, and the signal you reported last week, it was likely interference or a unique atmospheric phenomenon. This kind of isolated work, Dean, it can play tricks on you. Long hours, the desert isolation." "This isn't tricks," I cut in, my voice rising despite myself. "This is data. I've run every diagnostic, every cross-reference. I've eliminated every known variable. This structure, this signal, it's not natural and it's not human." I paused, then added, "And now, I'm seeing things, visual distortions, colors shifting, shadows moving when they shouldn't." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then the colleague's voice, softer now, but with an underlying current of concern that felt more patronizing than helpful. "Dean, perhaps you need to take a break. Come back to civilization. Get some rest. You've been out there too long." "You think I'm imagining it?" I asked, a bitter taste in my mouth. "I think you're under immense pressure, working in extreme conditions. Your mind is trying to make sense of something that isn't there. It's common. Look, just send me your raw data logs, I'll take a look, but don't expect miracles." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the plastic warm in my hand. He hadn't dismissed the data outright, not exactly, but he'd certainly dismissed me. I slammed the phone down, the sharp sound echoing in the small chamber. My eyes fell back to the monitor. The greens were still subtly off, a sickly chartreuse now, almost luminous. I glanced away towards the steel workbench against the far wall. A stack of printouts, usually stark white, seemed to possess a faint, unidentifiable sheen, as if reflecting a light source that wasn't there. I whipped my head around. Nothing. Just the inert, dusty shadow of the table leg. My breath hitched. It was happening more frequently now. Not just a flicker, but a deliberate, unsettling movement. I walked to the small window that overlooked the desert landscape. The familiar red rock formations, usually so solid and unchanging, seemed to ripple and sway, their ancient surfaces breathing in and out like vast, petrified lungs. The air itself pulsed, an invisible current distorting the distant mountains into jagged, impossible geometries. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't stress. My eyes were showing me something that defied all logic, all physics, and the worst part, I was the only one seeing it. I was losing my grip, or the world was. The glitch wasn't in the equipment, it was in me, or in the very fabric of my perception, and it was getting worse. The static still hummed in my ears, a phantom echo of the dismissive click. He hadn't seen it, couldn't see it, or perhaps wouldn't. The monitor glowed, a sickly green sheen overlaying the data I'd spent weeks compiling. My fingers trembled as I reached for the keyboard, the plastic cool against my skin. Off, I'd called it. A subtle deviation, a whisper in the noise floor, but whispers, I knew, could carry the most terrible truths. I zoomed in, then out, cycling through spectral bands, recalibrating filters. The raw data, a cascade of numbers and graphs, began to shimmer. It wasn't just a glitch, not a calibration error. There, in the deepest layers of the signal, a faint geometry began to coalesce. Not a simple wave, not a random burst. It was intricate, self-repeating, yet endlessly complex. Like a fractal, but alive, shifting with an impossible internal logic. Each iteration built upon the last, forming structures that defied the principles of any known transmission. My breath hitched. This wasn't a message, it was a blueprint. Days bled into nights. The desert outside my window became a blur of ochre and indigo. Coffee, black and bitter, was my only companion. The patterns didn't just exist in the signal anymore. Once I'd seen them, they began to bleed into everything. I'd catch a glimpse in the way dust motes danced in a shaft of sunlight. In the swirling eddies of sand, the wind whipped across the observatory floor. My eyes, strained and bloodshot, were recalibrating to a new reality. One afternoon, needing to clear the buzzing in my skull, I drove my old utility vehicle out. The engine grumbled, a comforting mechanical rhythm against the rising tide of internal chaos. I navigated the familiar winding path, the tires crunching over loose gravel, until I reached the summit of a remote mountain pass. The air here was thin, crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage. Below, the landscape stretched, vast and indifferent. I killed the engine. Silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, staring up at the sky. The clouds, usually amorphous, now seemed to arrange themselves with an unsettling precision. Wisps of cirrus, stretched thin against the boundless blue, curled into spirals that mirrored the very geometries I'd been uncovering in the signal. Below them, the erosion patterns on the ancient rock faces of the pass weren't random striations. They were etched with the same impossible, self-similar lines. Even the wind, sculpting the fine desert dust into miniature dunes along the ridges, seemed to follow these unspoken rules. It was as if the entire world, once a chaotic symphony, had suddenly revealed a hidden conductor. My hands felt clammy. This wasn't merely coincidence. The signal wasn't just transmitting information. It was informing the very fabric of my perception, overlaying a new grammar onto the mundane. I was seeing the world through its lens. A chilling thought, cold and sharp, pierced through my exhaustion. What if the patterns weren't just reflections, but the foundational principle of existence itself, only now being revealed? Back in the subterranean chamber, the hum of my equipment was a constant drone. The need to understand, to verify, to prove I wasn't simply fracturing under the pressure, became an obsessive compulsion. I had rudimentary self-monitoring gear, a crude array of sensors and a display unit I'd once used to track sleep cycles and stress responses during long, isolated studies. I affixed the electrodes to my temples, my scalp, the soft skin behind my ears. The display flickered to life, showing the familiar jagged lines of my own neural activity. I watched, my breathing shallow as the waves pulsed across the screen. At first, it was normal, the chaotic dance of a human mind. But then, as I focused, as I allowed my mind to drift, to attune itself to the unseen, something shifted. Faintly, at the edges of the familiar waveforms, a subtle, structured interference began to appear. It was almost imperceptible, a ghost in the machine of my own thoughts. I increased the magnification, adjusted the filters, pushing the equipment to its limits, and there it was. Not just noise, not artifacts, the impossible patterns. The same intricate, self-repeating geometries that twisted through the ancient signal, that now seemed to sculpt the clouds above the remote mountain pass, were emerging within the very electrical impulses of my brain. My own consciousness was being rewired, not by force, but by a subtle, insidious resonance. The signal wasn't just outside me, it was inside me. It wasn't just something I was studying, it was something I was becoming. This wasn't a transmission to be deciphered. It was a fundamental truth, a pervasive influence that was rearranging reality, starting with my own mind. The world, the data, my very thoughts, all of it was just another canvas for these unseen, terrifying patterns, and I was trapped within their unfolding design. The monitor's sickly green hummed, a low thrum against the ringing in my ears. The dismissive click from the director still echoed, a phantom sound, but the real noise was the growing static in my own skull. My fingers, still cool from the keyboard, trembled, hovering over the data I'd spent weeks compiling. It lay there, a grid of numbers and waveforms, screaming a truth no one else would acknowledge. I pushed away from the desk, the chair scraping against the concrete floor of the observatory's main chamber. The air was thin, carrying the scent of dust and ozone. Outside, the stars were a cold, indifferent spray across the obsidian sky, visible even through the dome's small viewing slit. I walked to the small kitchenette, filled a glass with water, and watched the tiny bubbles rise. My reflection stared back, eyes wide, a stranger's face etched with a fear that had nothing to do with the loneliness of this remote mountain pass. Sleep offered no escape. It had become a gateway, a deeper plunge into the signal's influence. The dream started subtly, a blurring of edges, a sense of vastness that stretched beyond the confines of my skull. Then came the shapes. They weren't geometric in any way I understood. Imagine a cube that was also a sphere, or a line that curved back on itself to form an impossible knot, yet existed in all its contradictory states simultaneously. They were forms of pure thought, not constructed from matter, but from an idea that defied physical manifestation. They swirled, coalesced, then shattered into fragments of light that were also sound, a silent chorus that resonated in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. I would wake, gasping, the taste of ash in my mouth. My hands would instinctively reach for a pen, for paper, a desperate urge to capture the fleeting images before they dissolved completely. My small journal, once filled with precise calculations and astronomical observations, now contained frantic, overlapping sketches. Jagged lines converged on impossible angles. Shaded areas suggested dimensions that couldn't exist. There was one particularly persistent shape, like a vast, unfolding polyhedron, its facets shifting and rearranging, each new configuration hinting at an older, deeper truth. It wasn't just an image, it felt like a presence watching me, learning me. The mental presence grew. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. One night the dreams became lucid nightmares. I was standing on a precipice, not of rock, but of pure, crystalline thought. Below me the impossible shapes writhed, forming and unforming, their silent chorus a deafening roar in my mind. Then the vast consciousness solidified. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the frantic beat of my own heart. It sees you. The thought wasn't mine. It wasn't asking, it was stating. It wasn't communicating in words, but in a raw, unfiltered stream of knowing. My own thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self felt like fragile, flickering candles in a hurricane. I saw snippets of my life flash before me, not as memories, but as data points being scanned, analyzed, categorized. The entity was pulling them apart, dissecting them. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I tried to move, but my dream body was paralyzed. The vortex pulsed again, and this time I felt a distinct pull. It was like being drawn into an immense vacuum, my essence stretching, thinning. My identity, Dean Marcus, archaeoastronomer, felt like a flimsy construct, easily unraveled. Join us. The command echoed not in words, but in a profound, undeniable imperative that resonated in the deepest parts of my being. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration. The impossible shapes coalesced around me, no longer just observed, but part of me, their contradictory nature becoming my own. The remote mountain pass, the observatory, the earth itself, all seemed to shrink, becoming insignificant specks in the face of this overwhelming, assimilating presence. I was losing myself. I knew it, and the horrifying truth was, a part of me, a tiny, terrified part, almost welcomed the oblivion. My fingers, still cool from the key, hovered over the console. They vibrated with a nervous energy that wasn't entirely my own. The signal. It was still there, a pulsing, rhythmic intrusion, a whisper that had become a shout only I could hear. Sleep had become a foreign concept. The observatory, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now felt like a pressurized chamber. Every shadow shifted, every creak of the old structure seemed to carry a hidden message. I pushed past the lingering resentment, the sting of being dismissed. Their blindness wasn't my problem. My problem was the impossible data unfurling across my screens, a language without words, a syntax without grammar, yet undeniably coherent. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the display. For weeks, I'd been chasing a specific pattern, a recurring sequence of phase shifts and amplitude modulations that seemed to anchor the chaos. It was like trying to find a single, consistent ripple in a storm-tossed ocean. My eyes burned, tracing the alien waveforms. I had isolated the segment, looped it, filtered it, twisted it through every algorithm I possessed. But it wasn't a code to be broken with logic. It was a truth to be perceived. Then something shifted, not on the screen but within me. A resonance. I saw a flicker, a momentary ghost image superimposed over the signal data, not an image I could describe, but a sensation of immense, crushing scale. My hand moved, unbidden, to a rarely used array of resonant frequency generators. I had been trying to decode the signal, but what if I needed to tune myself to it? My fingers danced across the controls, guided by an intuition that felt both alien and profoundly mine. A low hum filled the room, a counter-frequency that met the signal's pulse. The static in my head intensified, then abruptly coalesced. It wasn't static. It was information compressed beyond human comprehension, now expanding, unfurling like a monstrous, multidimensional bloom directly into my consciousness. The screen blurred, my vision tunneled. I wasn't seeing lines and graphs anymore. I was feeling concepts. Not words, not images, but pure, raw ideation. The first was non-linear temporality, not as a theory, but as a lived experience. Past, present, future collapsed into a single, terrifying now. I felt the echoes of events yet to occur, the reverberations of moments long gone, all simultaneously present, like threads in a tapestry being woven and unraveled at once. My stomach churned, a profound nausea as my mind tried to reconcile this impossible truth. Then came dimensional superposition, not 3 or 4 dimensions, but an infinite fractal layering. I saw, or rather understood, that the space around me, the air I breathed, the very atoms of my body, were merely the visible surface of an unfathomable depth. Every point in existence was also every other point, folded and stacked in ways that tore at the fabric of my sanity. The walls of the observatory seemed to breathe, to expand and contract into impossible geometries, their solidity a fragile illusion. The most horrifying concept was constrained consciousness. It wasn't a being, not a creature in any sense I understood. It was an awareness, vast and ancient, a fundamental principle of existence, not born but simply was. And this structure, the subterranean marvel beneath the desert, was not merely a transmitter. It was a receiver, a conduit. The signal wasn't a message from it. It was a cry of it. A resonance of its forced containment, a vibration against the impossible bonds that held it. The structure wasn't broadcasting, it was leaking. A constant, agonizing bleed of its raw, unadulterated presence into our reality. And the code I had broken wasn't a language. It was the echo of its struggle, the fundamental principles of its existence screaming against its confinement. My hands flew to my head, nails digging into my scalp. The static was a roaring torrent now, 1,000 voices speaking in concepts that shredded my understanding of physics, reality, and Dean Marcus. I was no longer an observer, I was a conduit. The entity wasn't trying to communicate, it was trying to escape, and I had just opened a door in my mind. I stumbled back from the console, knocking over my chair. The world spun, not just around me, but through me. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the taste of forgotten stars. I had to get out. I had to warn someone. The stars above, usually a comforting blanket, now seemed to wink with malicious understanding, their light just another facet of the terrifying, multi-layered truth. I needed to reach the nearest settlement to find someone, anyone who might listen. I drove blindly, the Jeep's tires kicking up dust on the winding track. The desert stretched out, an indifferent canvas beneath a sky that pulsed with the signal's rhythm. The mountain pass loomed ahead, a jagged scar against the pre-dawn glow. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a visible testament to my fading grip on reality. Halfway through the remote mountain pass, I stopped the vehicle. I looked back, down at the distant, almost invisible observatory, and then further to where I knew the subterranean structure lay hidden. It wasn't just leaking, it was listening. The concepts I had absorbed, they weren't just about its nature. They were about mine. It knew me, it knew my thoughts. It had been reaching out, not just transmitting, but receiving my efforts, my struggle, my very sanity. And now, through my broken mind, it saw the world. It saw everything. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat. It wasn't a scream, not a sob. It was a voice, not my own, yet speaking with my tongue, articulating a truth I could no longer deny. We are all just echoes in its dreaming. My vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't the screen. It was the world. I had broken the code, and in doing so, I had broken myself. The entity was still trapped, but now, so was I, a prisoner in the confines of a mind that was no longer entirely mine.